right, guys, let's do it. It's time for World War II. I know some of you have been waiting for this the whole year. Here it is, Chapter 29, World War II. Don't call it a comeback. It's the sequel. And as most sequels, they're bigger and there's a lot more, the body count's higher. So let's get into it, right? Chapter 29, World War II on the top of the page. I know some of you have been waiting all year for it. I know multiple students in the classroom are like World War II aficionados. So we're doing it. Let's hit it. I mean, first of all, the amount of countries involved in World War II is spectacular. You don't have to write anything here. I just wanted to pick some of the countries that are involved just to give you an idea of the conflict. This is truly a global war. You know, U.S., Britain, China, Japan, Ethiopia, Egypt, many of the countries in the Middle East, Australia, Canada, Indonesia, like Singapore. Like, it is a conflict that encapsulates almost the entire Earth. It's almost hard to understand. Okay, so let's get to it. So what actually leads to World War II happening? There's a lot of factors, some social, some political, some economic. So let's get into it. As Americans, we always take for granted, like, oh, everyone wants democracy, everyone likes democracy because our country's founded on a bunch of ragtag people pushing a world power out just so people have a voice in government. Well, okay, that is the exception to the rule. Remember, when World War I ends, Germany is no longer in control of its destiny, and Germany gets this new government put onto it. It's called the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic is going to move Germany from like an autocratic government into a form of democracy. Now, the thing is, the German people did not fight for this. They didn't even necessarily ask for this. So they're given a democracy. Okay, are they going to like it? Well, perhaps it would depend on what happens to Germany after World War I. And what happens to Germany after World War I is mostly a catastrophe. You know, their economy implodes. They're in a depression. There's moral decline. People are having, like, grandmas are selling themselves and their bodies, and just the society is ripping apart. You've got communists openly fighting with fascists on the streets of Germany, killing each other. It is a disaster. It is a total disaster. So in many Germans' minds, the part of the problem is really this democracy, this Weimar Republic. They didn't want it, and they associate it like things were better in the old days when we didn't have this. Another thing that leads to World War II is the absolute rage at the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, which is made up of like basically 150 clauses or so, 145, something like that, the vast majority, like almost all of them, are meant to hurt Germany in very personal and direct ways. The Treaty of Versailles is pretty much one of the major reasons World War II happens. It's a screw up by the Europeans. The idea that you should crush your enemies, well, that's fine. You can crush them, but what's going to happen a generation later? Think about this. World War II is going to start in 1939. World War I ended in 1919. That's a 20-year time span. Well, what does it take? What happens in 20 years? You basically get all the kids that were just born are now 20, they're fighting age. And so Germany's basically going right back into war mode because of the way World War I ended. And the other thing is economic devastation. It is hard to explain how desperate many of the countries, especially Germany, are going into World War II. Because of the War Reparations Clause, where they have to pay off billions of dollars in damages to all the other European countries, despite the fact that they don't have that, what does the German officials decide to do? They decide to just start printing the money out. And when you do that, you get hyperinflation. Not inflation, hyperinflation, which means your money becomes worthless. And here's a statistic that I dug up for you. So to understand how bad things get regarding the economics of Germany, in the year 1918, roughly a loaf of bread would cost 1/4 of a Reichsmark. A Reichsmark is basically $1. So it basically costs you a quarter to buy a loaf of bread. Because they hyperinflate, they just start printing. They're like, okay, you want all these $3 billion, we'll just print it. Their money, by the year 1923, it roughly cost 80 billion Reichsmarks to buy a loaf of bread. 80 billion. So all the money people have in the bank is worthless. To even buy, like, the idea that if you want to buy something from the store, you have to bring a wheelbarrow full of cash. Prices are changing so rapidly that people would go to lunch, and by the time the lunch ends, they couldn't even afford it because the prices went up. It is inflation on a devastating level, and the Germans, for all the things that happened at the end of World War I, they say, well, this wasn't our fault. We did, and they're going to blame and be resentful towards the the rest of Europe. Here's a couple examples of what hyperinflation looks like. This lady's trying to keep her house warm, so what is she burning? She's burning Reichsmarks. They're not worth anything. Basically, it would cost more. It would cost more to buy paper to heat her furnace, so she's just burning the Reichsmarks. They're garbage. Look at this lady. She needed a New Year's Eve costume, so she just used Reichsmarks. Right? They're worthless. These kids are flying a kite. Paper's expensive. You know it's not. The money, it's garbage. They're playing Legos. Everyone likes Legos. Instead of blocks, they play with blocks of billions of dollars of Reichsmarks. And this guy's actually a banker. So when you print trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars out, how do you keep track of it? That's what it looks like. Okay, so now let's walk to World War II. Like, what actually starts happening? In 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia, which if you didn't take my class, boy, that's weird, right? Why are the Italians attacking a random African country? But you should know the reason why. Because at the age of imperialism, Italy is the one country, the one European country that did not take the territory that they were given, which is Ethiopia. They're embarrassed. They're at this point, Italy's economy is in the garbage. They're also in a depression. So this strongman, who we've talked about in the past, named Mussolini, takes control, overthrows their democracy, turns Ethiopia into a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship. He says, all right, in order to consolidate power, I have to defeat the Ethiopians. So even though it's like 40, 50 years later, he attacks, and they defeat them. There's no Menelik II. There's no great leader to stop the Italians. And now the Italian people say, well, maybe things are different now. Maybe Italy is becoming a world power again, like the Romans, like the Neo-Romans, the new Rome. And so Ethiopia gets smashed. They beg the world for help. They beg. And they actually specifically beg the League of Nations, this group that was set up to prevent future wars. The League is too weak to help. And this is a problem, one, because America didn't join. Whether that was right or wrong, that's a debate you still got to have. But here's the thing. When the League does nothing, this now tells every other aggressor on the world stage, we can do what we want. There's no one policing us. And that's where you're going to see a lot of aggression happening real quick, boom, 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 and World War II is going to start. Okay, 1937 now, right? We're still not to World War II. Japan crushes China. Japan and China have this ancient rivalry. They fought back and forth multiple times. And what Japan wants to have this Indo-Pan-Asian empire. Japan wants to lead pretty much the eastern part of the globe. They want to take over. They want to be in charge. To do that, they're going to need resources. And so they crush the Chinese. They go in there, they slaughter tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. China's army is weak and pathetic. China's been spiraling since the age of imperialism. They're weak. They're getting just wrecked by the Japanese. And then specifically, the Japanese attacked this one city, Nanjing, which I'll get into in a minute. Here's why this matters, and this should matter to you as an American. This is what leads to Pearl Harbor. Most Americans have no clue why Pearl Harbor happens. Well, the U.S. looks at what Japan's doing, and they are murdering thousands of people, and they're obviously hyper-aggressive, and the United States cuts off Japan from any type of war-making materials. Now, let's talk about that, because it's important to understand. Japan requires fuel. They're an island. They don't have a ton of refineries. They don't have a ton of oil wells. They required, in order to have this Pan-Asian, this giant Asian empire, they have to have fuel. They have to have steel. They have to have all the components required for a war machine. And the United States says, whoa, what are you doing? You're getting aggressive in the Pacific? We cut them off. Literally at this point in 1937, the Japanese now recognize that America is their problem. And in order to conquer that half of the earth, they're going to have to take the United States out. They start prepping the attack on Pearl Harbor, which won't happen until 1941, almost immediately. Japan is running drills and prepping years in advance, and the whole time they're giving America like peace awards and saying how great of a partner they are. They see America as in the way, and the reason why America did this is because of the brutality that they unleashed on the Chinese. Now, I don't want this to be like theoretical. I want you to actually see it. It is important to actually see what Japan did that caused this reaction from America. Okay, you don't have to look at this. I'm going to show some pretty sensitive pictures about the rape of Nanking or Nanjing. These these are actually tamer photos. Some of the stuff is unbelievably horrible, but this will give you an idea of why, what happened. It's important to, I think, see history. Okay, real quick, here's an American paper. Butchery marks the capture of Nanjing, this major city in China. So here's an example of one of the photos. The thing about these photos, they were taken by Japanese soldiers usually about what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese, which means they have pride in this. So this Chinese man has been tied up, and they're doing bayonet stabbing drills. They're practicing their bayonets, which are the 18-inch blade at the end of rifles. They're actually using him as a practice dummy, stabbing him again and again and again, and they're taking photos of this as they go. This is a really important picture because, like whenever you go to other places, you often take a photograph, you take a picture, and you're like, hey, look here, Mr. Rico's by the arch in St. Louis or this, that, or the other. Yeah, he's taking a photo, except when you look at this Japanese soldier, he's got a head in his hand, and he has what looks like a katana in his other, and he's smiling, like he's proud of this. This is something he's going to send home. And this tells you how subhuman the Japanese now viewed not only the Chinese, but pretty much all of their Asian counterparts. And the damage that they're going to do is unbelievable. And this isn't just in Japan. What they do in the Philippines and these other countries, in Singapore, is unbelievable. Now, these are what are called comfort women. This is something we don't like to talk about. It's pretty awful. But the Japanese, they took all these Chinese women captive, not just in Nanjing, but throughout all of China and other countries. And what they would do is they would follow the army, and then at night they were raped by the soldiers, often many, many people at night. And these women would be pregnant, and they would have to follow the army to be used by the soldiers. And so the reason why this is called the rape of Nanjing is there are tens of thousands of women who are murdered and raped in the city. This little girl starving to death because her parents were killed. And this is another thing, too. When parents or guardians are killed, there's no one to feed people. You get you get tens of thousands of children starving to death. She's in the throes of death. And this just gives you an idea of how subhuman the Japanese treated the Chinese. They cut the heads off all of these people in this battalion, took a photo of all the people they'd murdered. A lot of these are civilians. They're just like soldiers. They're just killing people indiscriminately. So these are the basic numbers you can pick up. 300,000 murders, 28,000 rapes. Something that helps bring this home is that there was a radio contest between two soldiers, and they were using swords to cut people's heads off during this time in Nanjing. And the radio stations in Tokyo and stuff would actually be playing. They're like, they would name the different soldiers, and they would say, oh, so and so's cut off 70 heads, and so and so's cut off 82. He's winning. And they were actually having a contest of over people they could decapitate more. This is why the U.S. steps way back. They're like, okay, we are cutting you off. Like, this is unacceptable. There's an execution. Another execution with a sword. Okay, so that is what was going on between the United States and Japan. In 1939, the official start of World War II is the invasion of Poland. The invasion of Poland is when Germany attacks Poland, which is a large country in between Germany and the Soviet Union. At the exact same time, the Soviet Union attacks from the other half of Poland. They act together, almost simultaneously. They rip Poland in half. And now the Europeans see that the Germans aren't going to stop. This is not going to end. They took over the Sudetenland and Austria. They took over Czechoslovakia, the Rhineland. They're not going to stop. So when they finally attack Poland, and the Poles are doing everything they can to stop us, there are stories of Polish soldiers fighting on horseback against tanks. They're fighting two superpowers, the Soviet Union on one side, and they're fighting the Germans on the other. And the atrocities against the Polish, every few years they still find more mass graves of soldiers, hundreds and sometimes thousands of soldiers who were just captured and shot dead and stuck in the ground. So they have no way to win this. And now at this point, England and France realize Germany's not going to stop. We can't bribe them. We can't have these agreements. Nothing's going to work. We have to go to war. But it's probably a little late now at this point. Germany's been preparing for this for years. And now the French and the English think they can go in there and stop them. What is the reason why they're really not ready is Hitler is using a new tactic called blitzkrieg. You remember that in World War I, the fighting immediately bogged down and turned into trench warfare, and basically no territory was taken. Blitzkrieg, this concept, which means lightning war, and if you watch football, you know what a blitz is. It's when you run in there and try to hit the quarterback as quickly as possible. It's when you use combined arms. You use as much vehicle and Air Force, ground attack, infantry, and you move as quickly to engage the enemy as possible. And the reason why this works is when you're hitting people with tanks and artillery and aircraft and bombers, and you're dropping parachute troops behind them, paratroopers, they're not ready for it. Because like the Europeans, like the British and the French are thinking, okay, we've declared war. We'll probably be at war in several months. No, you won't. You're at war now. Like the Germans are coming right now. They're using their vehicles to go as fast and as far as possible right now. And while you're trying to prepare, you're already fighting. And this tactic is the appropriate tactic for the times. As I talked about in World War I, they had new weapons. They didn't know how to use them. This is how you use combined vehicle attacks. Before people can get reinforced and entrenched, you hit them. So obviously, I might make this note. Britain and France declare war on Germany. Now, what the French are doing, there's this old saying, it's not Mr. Rico's, it's that generals fight the last war, which is why most wars at the beginning is just massacres, because you're thinking in the old ways. What the French have developed is this thing called the Maginot Line. This is their big trump card to stop the Germans. And after World War I, they set up hundreds of miles of fortifications in between their border and the German border. And sometimes it looks like these giant bunkers. They're steel bunkers covered in concrete. They come up out of the ground with giant artillery. Sometimes it's fake houses set up where there's machine gun nests. There's anti-vehicle lines. And it goes several stories underground. All the Maginot Lines, these fortifications are connected by rail lines, and they have positive air pressure, so you can't even get poison gas in there. And they've got food supplies, and they've got weapon supplies, and movie theaters, and they can communicate with each other. The point is, it creates like the perfect defensive fortification. So if we get into like a World War I scenario, they'll never penetrate this. But here's the thing: you're not in World War I. You're in World War II. And the idea of this giant, static, non-moving defensive structure, that doesn't work. The world has changed. Just to show you a picture of what the Maginot Line it goes through, look, it's got fuel supplies, telephone, airlocks, all these spots for airplanes and tanks and vehicles, all underground. Just one of the turrets look like this. Look, you got spotters, and you've got directors and rangefinders, hunter-killer units, all that stuff. Yeah, but that doesn't work. Because the Maginot Line doesn't move. And you know what the Germans are going to do? They're just going to go around it. Look at how complex. They spend billions of francs on this. Billions of dollars. And the worst part about this isn't that it's going to be useless. The worst part is it creates like this Maginot mindset, this defensive idea that we can spend years behind this defensive structure, building an army, training our troops, and then we'll go on the offensive. That's not how wars work. You can't just expect that the enemy will fight you when you're ready. No, they're here. They're coming. And the French think that they have at least months. Maybe they've got years to, prep. They don't. The Germans are just going to go around this. You're fighting now. And so you see the dark part of the line. It shows where that Maginot Line is really heavy, and then you've got the dotted lines. And so what the Germans are going to do is they're just going to go around it. They're going to go through the Germans are going to go through Belgium, much like they did in World War I. They're going to use the Schlieffen Plan. And so the French troops that are in the Maginot Line actually get surrounded, which is actually even worse. They get totally surrounded. So now the line not only is it static and not moving, and they think they've got months, if not years, to prepare a large army. No, the army that they have is already surrounded. And Hitler tells the French government, surrender now. We're going to put a new French government in place. Now, the French have options here. They can fight a bloody, horrible guerrilla war against the Germans and make them pay and slow them down. But the ramifications, the cost is going to be horrible, right? Because the Germans are going to start blowing up French cities, including Paris, including the Palace at Versailles. They're going to have to pay a price. The French decide not to pay that price. They immediately surrender to the Germans. And now, this enemy who the Germans fought for 4.5 years is out of the war in 6 weeks. They're gone. The British don't know what's going on. The British thought that they would have months to get their army into place onto the continent of Europe and then join their ally and then overrun the Germans. Wrong! Your ally's already gone. You're now alone. Little joke here. Just go around the line. Just go around the line. Now, not every French person surrenders. Which, by the way, in today's world, like, the French have this, like, I don't know. There's a stereotype that French people they like to surrender, and that is a 20th century stereotype, because before this you had Napoleon. The French were known for being these great fighters, but because of this, the French surrender. A couple officers, like a guy named Charles de Gaulle, who ended up being the first president of France after the war, they flee. A lot of the officers, they go into Britain, and then they fight a guerrilla war trying to get their country back, which they're not going to be able to do alone. But many of the rest of the French surrender, and now all the French vehicles, airplanes, ships, tanks, all that stuff now are a part of the German military, and they're going to have to fight their own army. Oh, whenever you go to Paris, right, you got to take photos, right? Even Hitler. When you go to Paris, you got to go to the Eiffel Tower, and Hitler can't even smile. And just to show you this, and this picture really matters, this is what Europe looks like in a few weeks of World War II. Like Europe is gone. The blue and the dark blue are German or German allies. Europe is gone. The only thing left really is Britain. There it is, and they better get ready. Now, Britain knows it's coming. They've known for a long time. Specifically, the guy I'm thinking of, his name is Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill has been warning Britain literally for years that don't trust Hitler, we're going to end up back in war, we should start preparing now. Nobody did that. Neville Chamberlain refused to do that, refused to prepare, did not want to look at the reality of the situation. And so he gets voted out, and now you get Winston Churchill on the eve of war. And he has very little time to prepare the British. And so I have links here. I would click on like one or two of his speeches, because the interesting thing about the way people speak says a lot about what they're trying to do. You know, when we look at speeches of Hitler now, like, people will say, oh man, he's crazy, he's got these wild hand motions like Mr. Rico, and he's foaming and gesticulating. The reason why Hitler talks the way Hitler talks isn't necessarily a reflection of his direct personality, although it may be, but what he's trying to tap into is the fact that the German people are angry, and he wants to channel that to do his political goals. Winston Churchill's in a different circumstance. Winston Churchill's in a situation where his country's about to be invaded. They're an island. There's nowhere to go. You can't run anywhere. When they get invaded, they're going to be surrounded and broken and murdered. And so what he taught, whenever you listen to a Churchill speech, he talks slowly and deliberately and calmly with almost a flat affect. Just do your duty. Do what you have to do. Do what you need to do. And it's not that he doesn't have urgency. And it's not that he's not freaking out. It's that we have to be calm now, because they're coming. It's all going to be on us. It's coming to us. And so he starts telling British people, resist no matter what. Resist on the beaches, resist in the ocean, resist in the skies, resist in the cities. You have to fight in the forest. You have to fight everywhere, because there's nowhere for us to go, and they're coming to us now. So this starts what's called Operation Sea Lion. This is a German operation to take over Britain. And if you know what a sea lion is, it's basically a seal, right? A seal is an animal, lives in the water and land. It's got flippers, it's a mammal, and it can swim and then it can jump up on land. And that's precisely what Hitler wants to do. They're going to cross the English Channel, and then they're going to, once they touch the island of Britain, they're going to do they're going to be able to win, right? Because Germany's army is massive and the British army is not. And here's the thing about the British. Their navy has always kept them safe in the past. They would just put their navy in the channel. They can't do that now, because aircraft will just bomb their navy. So now the channel is empty. But here's the other thing. Germany can't just cross the channel, because the British have an air force as well. They have the Royal Air Force, the RAF. So what Germany, what Hitler has to do is destroy the Royal Air Force. And once they do, they're going to have an open lane, and they're going to attack Britain, and it's going to be over. So the British have to win this battle called the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain is an air campaign that goes on for months, and the Germans are bombing and they're fighting the British Air Force. They just need to deplete the Air Force. They've surrounded the island. So here's the thing: the British can't get reinforcements. They can't get the equipment for new planes. The British have to work with what they have. And the minute their Air Force is gone, here comes the army. It is over. They cannot lose this. And the British, if you ever read about this, are like, there's planes coming down with bullet holes, and they're fixing them up in a few minutes, ripping the pilot out, putting a new pilot up, and sending them up, constantly fighting day and night, day and night. And this goes on for months, and after months, Hitler calls off the attack. And so Britain wins the Battle of Britain. And I will say this is like one of those moments in history where a lot of historians say this is one of Hitler's probably biggest mistake. Because once you commit to this, you have to do it. You have to take it over, because if you do anything else, now you've got the British behind you, and if you've got an enemy to your back. And it's also going to give the United States a place to land if they want to help the Allies. But Germany calls off the attack, and so Operation Sea Lion is a failure, and the Battle of Britain is a success for the British. Now, moving on here. And this is why he calls off Operation Sea Lion. In 1941, Hitler's got a new idea, and it's called Operation Barbarossa, and it is the absolute annihilation, destruction of the Soviet Union's government, taking over all of the Soviet territory, deposing Stalin, and Germany, by doing this, will become the largest country in the world, right? Because they'll have all the territory they've taken in Europe, they'll have Poland, and they'll have the entire Soviet Union. And this makes sense, right? Because Hitler, what did he want? He wanted Lebensraum. He wanted living space. And he's looking at the Soviet Union. And even though he has a non-aggression pact with Stalin, come on, there's no honor among thieves. He might as well attack him. Now, the thing is, Hitler's not stupid. He knows that trying to take the Soviet Union, the biggest issue is, of course, attacking Russia in a land war, is the territory is not conducive to its invasion. They have terrible winters. And so what Hitler does is he invades much earlier in the year than say, like Napoleon does, because he doesn't want to get slowed down. Matter of fact, he tells his troops, we're only going to have summer uniforms, no winter uniforms. By wintertime, it's going to be over. Now, the crazy thing about Operation Barbarossa, too, is Stalin is taken off guard. Stalin knows Hitler's a psychopath like himself. They're both crazy dictators. Not crazy is probably not the right word, but they're both fanatical dictators who are ruthless. And Hitler starts putting thousands of troops on the border of the Soviet Union. Stalin sends a message saying, what are you doing? Hitler says, we're just doing a training exercise, which, by the way, is what Putin told everyone before he invaded Ukraine. If anyone ever says there's a training exercise and they're putting troops on your border, you're being invaded. And Stalin trusts Hitler. And then, boom, Operation Barbarossa begins. And the beginning part of Operation Barbarossa is an absolute slaughter. The Russians are not ready for it. The Germans just cut through them like a hot knife through butter. And here's the creepiest part for Stalin. As the Germans are pouring into Russia, Russians are cheering for the Germans because they hate Stalin. And they absolutely hate, so they are cheering for him. And the United States' intelligence agencies told our president, Russia's going to collapse in a few weeks. They have no chance against Hitler. They have no chance. So what happens? Obviously, Operation Barbarossa is not a success. So there's a couple things that happen here. One is Hitler's psychopathic racist, and he believes that the Russian people, he calls them mud people, and he tells his troops, look, if any city inside of Russia gives you a hard time, if you get shots come from that city, I want you to encircle the little town and kill everybody. Now that sounds like a strong move. It's actually incredibly stupid. Because if you kill everyone in town A, and town B hears that, and town B, maybe they were happy to see you, now you have to fight every single person in the next town. Men, women, and children. Because when you start killing every person, now you literally have to fight every person. They're going to die anyway. And so now Hitler's committed basically into a total war inside Russia or the Soviet Union. Now the other part that maybe Hitler wasn't prepared for is that Stalin is every bit as ruthless as he is. And Stalin pushes an order. It's pretty infamous. It's called Order 227. The title of it is not One Step Back. And what Russian troops do when going into battle is that their officers put their machine gun nests behind their own armies. Well, that's kind of weird. You usually have to put a machine gun up front. Well, the machine guns aren't there for the Germans. You see, when you go into battle as a Russian soldier, if you try to retreat because you're losing, your own officers will mow you down with a machine gun. And so the idea here is what Stalin's going to do is use the fact that Russia has a larger population and just use human wave attacks on the Germans. And at first, the level of death that the Germans unleash on these Russian soldiers who are being squeezed between their own officers and the Germans is unbelievable. Millions of men are dying. But the thing is, over time, these wave attacks are taking a toll on the Germans, and they're starting to lose men, and then suddenly their attacks start slowing down, and suddenly the attacks start taking longer and longer, and meanwhile the weather's starting to get colder, and they are stuck inside the Soviet Union as the weather turns. And here's the reality of World War II, and Americans, we often don't consider this. 7 out of 8 of every Nazi German soldier is killed by the Russians, not the United States. They are killed in this horrible warfare between the Soviet Union and the Germans. And the numbers speak for themselves. Somewhere between 20 and 27 million people in the Soviet Union died during World War II. The total number of people in the war, what is it, like 80, 85, 90 million people? That's almost a third. It's unbelievable death. What's the United States doing? Well, the United States is not in this war because the Americans are like, hey, this is a European problem. The Europeans are killing each other again. This is a tradition for them. Let them do it. Our president at that time, President 32, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, says, you know what, at some point we are going to end up fighting. We're going to get pulled into this. There's no way out. This is a global conflict. He starts training our military. He says, look, it's a defense force. We're going to do this just so we're safe. And so he starts training the troops, and then what he does is he has Congress pass what's called the Lend-Lease Act. And you should have covered this in American history last year. The Lend-Lease Act is what the United States realizes that we're probably going to end up on the side of the British, what's left of the French, and the Soviet Union, who the United States does not get along with. We've already had some conflicts with them. And what this does is we start giving old equipment, old military weapons. We start giving away old destroyers. We start giving bullets and medical supplies and uniforms and clothing and actually airplanes to specifically the Soviet Union and the British. And we say, stay alive. That's what FDR is saying. He's saying, stay alive, because if we end up in this war, we're going to need allies. And so the U.S. is feeding the machines, feeding their troops, doing all these things to keep them around. Now, how does the U.S. actually get into war? So here it is, 1941, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, is the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor is really a well-orchestrated attack. Because the thing is, you have to remember this. The Japanese are planning to attack the United States. They've been planning for years. The Americans are not prepared for this. They haven't been considering it, even though 20 years earlier, an American actually wrote a book saying that the next major attack on the United States will be at Pearl Harbor. Like, it's not unimaginable. It's not unimaginable this can happen, but they totally take the United States off guard. Well, how do they do that? Well, many of the Japanese officers have studied in the United States. They understand American culture. So they've been planning this attack for years. And one part is they pick a great date to attack the United States. They pick in December. What are most Americans thinking about in December? Christmas. They're thinking about Christmas, Santa, all that stuff. Americans aren't thinking about, getting pulled into a war. They also pick the day of the week that most Americans are not prepared to fight, and that's Sunday. And not just Sunday morning. Think about it. Soldiers are in probably one of two places Sunday morning. One, they're sleeping off a hangover from drinking the night before, or two, they're getting ready to go to church. So your mind is not that we're suddenly going to be attacked. So the day and the time is picked perfectly by the Japanese. The Japanese have been running drills for basically years. They've got a mock Pearl Harbor that they've been having their airplanes and their dive bombers practicing bombing. Every one of their planes, the bombers have little cards with the name of the ship that each one is supposed to attack. They are ready to do this. And the major target at Pearl Harbor, which is a naval base, destroy as many ships as you can, destroy as many airplanes as you can. And there is one ship the Japanese must destroy, and those are America's aircraft carriers. Because quietly, since World War I, aircraft carriers have become super powerful. In World War I, the most powerful ships were battleships, these giant ships with these huge guns that can fire for miles. But by World War II, it is understood that the most deadly ships are aircraft carriers. And then think about this. An aircraft carrier can have hundreds of planes on board. Each plane has a bomb, and those planes can go hundreds of miles. That means you can blow up things hundreds of miles away with hundreds of ships. They're unbelievable. So the Japanese say, we have to kill the American carrier. I believe there are 4 carriers there. And so on that day, boom, sneak attack comes. The Americans aren't at war in the morning, and then all of a sudden they're at war. They're being bombed. The Americans aren't even sure who's attacking them at first. And there's a lot of things that the United States could have picked up on to know this attack was coming. Here's one. They knew that their giant navy, American intelligence picked up that the Japanese Navy left Tokyo, so it was going somewhere. Here's another thing the United States could have picked up on. In all the Japanese embassies across the world, they were destroying all of their telegram machines, saying we're going to war, or destroy all your papers. Another thing is, early in the morning, before 7 a.m., a little submarine tried to sneak into Pearl Harbor, and the United States picked up on it in sonar, and they destroyed it. It was such a small sub that it had to actually be with a fleet. And the last thing, and the U.S. probably should have picked up on this, is a giant radar signature was moving towards Pearl Harbor. They picked up on it. They saw it. It was so big it was like a cloud. But the Americans thought, one of the officers said, "Oh, it looks like we're getting some planes coming in from the mainland." They didn't bother to double check it. So boom, the Japanese hit, and they destroyed. Look at the numbers here. They kill 2,400 Americans. They destroy hundreds of airplanes. They sink or destroy or damage 21 American ships. But here's the problem: they don't get a single aircraft carrier. By a stroke of luck, earlier in that morning, much earlier, the aircraft carriers left Pearl Harbor to do training exercises. And the reason why this is significant is when the Japanese attack, they're attacking for hours. They attack for 3+ hours, and they're bombing buildings and shooting and destroying the ships. But after 3 hours, they realize the aircraft carriers aren't here. They have to call their attack off. Because here's the thing, their entire Navy's out there. And if they don't know where the American carriers are, what if the American carriers are sneaking up on them and they're going to unload all their planes onto their Navy? That's incredibly dangerous. So the Japanese have to stop their attack. It's a good attack. It's a great sneak attack, but it fails at this important thing. What the Japanese wanted to do was to hit America so hard that America would immediately sue for peace, ask for peace. But to do that, they would have to completely 100% destroy the entire American Pacific fleet. And they don't. They just damage and destroy and kill thousands of people, but they don't destroy the fleet. And this is going to leave Japan in a vulnerable position because America can produce a lot more than they can. So what happens? What's America's reaction to Pearl Harbor? It's not what the Japanese are hoping for. The Japanese are hoping for an immediate surrender. Instead, America's Congress approves a declaration of war against Japan, and then the Americans say we're going to join the Allies, the British, what's left of the French, and the Soviet Union. And before America can even declare war, Germany and Italy already declare war on the United States. So now America is a part of the Allies. Germany, Japan, and Italy, the tripartite signees, are now in what are called the Axis powers. There's now a world war going, and the United States is going to have to fight 2 separate wars, one against the Japanese in the Pacific and one against the Italians and the Germans in Europe. So the other problems with the Japanese is they were hoping that Americans would surrender right away. But what actually happens is 5 million men immediately volunteer to fight in the military because they're so angry about what the Japanese do. Now, 5 million men is a tremendous amount of manpower. But the United States isn't doing one war. It's going to fight 2 separate wars. They need more. They draft another 10 million men. 15 million men. That's more people than live currently in Ohio. Think of this huge population. And remember, America's population is much smaller in the 1940s. So they have this giant 15 million men armies, and they're going to go to war all over the planet. Selective service is created to draft American men. American men, if you were in relatively okay health, you were going to be drafted. You were going to be drafted at this time. And to be honest, even when people were drafted, it's not like a lot of times we have this idea that's like the Vietnam War where a lot of people were sad about it. A lot of men wanted to fight. There are stories of men that get drafted and they end up they're found like they have a physical condition where they can't fight, and a lot of some of these people killed themselves because they wanted to fight for the country. Now, one of the great stories of World War II, and I think it's kind of it's not explained always really well. It's actually what women's part was in this. If all of the men are going to war, who is going to supply them with weapons? Someone has to do that. And at this time, women primarily did domestic labor at home. But what our government and a lot of the corporations and companies were asking was, women, come to work. We need you to build the bullets and the uniforms and the rubber for the tires and the treads and the tanks and the aircraft domes and the propellers. We need you to do this because there's no one left at home to do it. And so this is where women leave the home and they start going into the workforce to start producing things. The thing that the Japanese too hadn't realized, or even the Germans, they thought that America's production capacity was, they had this standard graph of what America could produce, but they were off by a factor of 10. America had been sitting in the Depression longer than most countries, and America had empty factories from coast to coast that were producing nothing. But now that America's going to war, all those factories fill up with people building things, and they immediately come to life. And the government, in almost a fascistic way, starts using its war powers to direct companies what they have to make. Like Ford, you got to make tanks, you got to make this, you got to make that, you got to make that. America's entire economy goes into a giant war economy. Every resource, whether it's sugar or rubber or gasoline, everything is being utilized for this war effort. America becomes one giant war machine from coast to coast. And a big part of that is what women were doing. A lot of the women took incredible pride in the jobs that they had in these war-making industries. But think about this. Every bullet, every bomb, every propeller, those items were being used by their relatives, their brothers, their sons, their uncles, their fathers. And so the women in these factories took tremendous pride because they realized if they made bad stuff, that's going to get their family members killed. That's where you get the whole Rosie the Riveter thing, because the idea that we need you to come and do this because there's really no men left. So yeah, we can do it. Okay, so now to understand, how is America going to prosecute this war? America falls into what's called the Europe First strategy. Churchill and FDR realized that Hitler is going to have to be the priority. He's more dangerous. Because the thing is, if you can free the Europeans, then you can utilize their help to fight the Japanese. And so the strategy is the Europe First strategy. And if you're doing Europe first, and this is kind of ironic, target one is North Africa. And you're like, well, Mr. Rico, you just told me it's Europe first. Why are we doing North Africa? There's a very simple reason why. Because this is now a war where we use mechanized weapons, right? We use vehicles, tanks, and all these artillery, self-propelled artillery. The best way to stop a vehicle isn't to blow it up, isn't to shoot it, isn't to target it. It's to cut it off from something that it requires, and that's fuel. And let's get into this. So this is called Operation Torch. And so the idea is America is going to help the British who are fighting in North Africa to defeat the Nazis and the Italians. And why is that? Well, Italy's been kind of in North Africa now for years, since 1935. And in North Africa, there's a lot of oil. And the Germans in particular need this oil for their war machine. They've got all these amazing tanks and airplanes, some of the best that have been being produced in the world. And you don't want to fight those if you don't have to. And all you have to do is cut them off from oil. The problem is they're having a hard time beating the Italians and then the Germans. You see, the British early on in the war went into North Africa, and they started to beat up the Italians. The Italians, they defeated the Ethiopians, but when they actually had to fight another competent military, the British started pushing them around and just beating them up. So what Germany did is Germany sent one of its best tank commanders, a guy named Erwin Rommel, down into Africa, and they start getting into these massive tank battles. And the British start losing at times, and it's kind of a stalemate, and they cannot beat the Nazis in North Africa. And then the longer the Germans can hold North Africa, they're getting more and more oil. It keeps their war machine going. So the United States is like, well, we're going to target that. So the United States joins Britain in Operation Torch now to knock the Germans out of Africa, to stop this war machine. And the combined forces of the British and now the Americans defeat the Germans and the Italians, and they knock out North Africa, and they take a lot of the oil away from this giant war machine. You know, I'll let you write while I'll tell some quick stories here. The American tank commander in charge, there's some epic tank battles here in North Africa. The American tank commander's name is George Patton, and he thought he was like Alexander the Great reborn. He's this really interesting man who had like this nickel-plated gun with ivory handles, and he just had a way of talking that inspired people. And they sent him down there, and he'd been studying Rommel's techniques for years, his tactics. He'd been reading the things that he wrote, and he used those against him, and that's how he was able to beat him. So really quickly, here's some of. Let's go to the size of the artillery shells they're firing there in the desert. That's Montgomery. That's the British leader of the North African forces. This is George Patton. That's the United States, his tank commander over there. And this is Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, as the Germans called him. To show you some, you can see vehicles all over the place. Okay, so Operation Torch is a success. Now the thing is, if you take North Africa, there's a very obvious lane to now invade Europe. What is so close to North Africa? Well, you might say Spain. And you could launch from North Africa into Spain. It's reasonable if that's what you're thinking. Totally reasonable, right? It's right there. The thing is, the Spanish are in the middle of a civil war, and, you know, why engage them? And you might actually make more enemies. But there is another inviting target, and that is Italy. Italy is hanging down. It looks like they have big boot. The problem is, you're going to have to attack one of the major aggressors. That's Mussolini's Italy. Can you do it? Well, what the United States and Britain do is they launch and they go to Sicily first, that island right below. It looks like the soccer ball. And with the help of some unsavory characters, this mafia group that it works, kind of a group of criminals, they help direct and help the soldiers go into Italy. And they like curb stomp. They totally beat up Mussolini. And they start pushing the Italians back. The Italian army in their own territory. They're starting to push them up the Italian peninsula, which is shocking. So they're winning. And the problem now is Hitler, who's in like Central Europe, is like, oh my gosh, these Italians, he thought he had some very powerful allies. They're terrible. So he has to start sending German troops down into the Italian peninsula. And the way Italy is, they've got a lot of hills and things, so there's a lot of choke points. So the Germany's now set up to reinforce the Italians, and now they create a choke point, and they can't move. The Allies cannot push further up into Italy, and now there's just a lot of death, and they've bogged down because the Germans are so well trained, and so now there's a stalemate. So this did not work. They were really hoping the Allies could go right up into Central Europe, but it does not work because the Germans moved too quickly. So Target 2, the invasion of Italy, it's a success in that they beat the Italians up, but they cannot take the northern Italian territory. Now, what's happening in the meantime? I have to talk about this because I don't think we consider this. America is 3,000 miles. The United States is 3,000 miles from England. And that's a lot of territory to have to travel via the ocean. And the thing is, the Germans recognized in World War I that submarines, the Untersee boats, were so powerful and so useful that going into World War II, they built hundreds of them. Hundreds of submarines, because they realized that they could neutralize other surface fleets and disrupt shipping. And so, in World War I, convoys, groups of ships were used to defeat submarines, right? The idea is that you would put your troops, transports in the middle, or your supplies in the middle. You'd put destroyers around them. A submarine would have to attack the destroyers. Maybe it blows a destroyer up, but then the other destroyers would go blow your submarine up, and that's one less sub, right? You'll trade one destroyer for a sub. So that convoys were really dangerous to subs in World War I. So what the Germans have created is a new tactic, and it's called wolf packs. Often German submarines would not operate alone. They would operate with a group of submarines, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 5, and up to like 20 submarines would be working together in unison. Now imagine you've got this giant convoy of ships, and you're waiting for like a ship to blow up, and then you can try to find the submarine. But what happens when 10 ships blow up at once? Because 10 different submarines target different ships at once. It's absolute pandemonium. Wolf packs were super dangerous. To give you an example, look at the numbers that I put in your notes. In the first 4 months of the war, the United States loses 87 ships. That's almost 90 ships in 4 months. Think about how many thousands of dead soldiers that are that never made it to combat. How many millions of pounds of steel and bullets and ammunition and resupplies and medical equipment. How much resources were destroyed before it ever even got to war. The submarines were everywhere. They were all the way up into the northern parts of the Gulf of Mexico. They literally were going everywhere. So what prevents the submarines from totally taking over? Well, there's two major technologies that have developed at this time. One is sonar, which sends out sound waves underwater. It goes ping, and when it hits, there's a guy listening. When that sound wave hits something, it sends an echo back, and the technician can say, okay, there's something approximately 100 feet below us moving in this direction. And then once they start to get sonar, they can actually start to peer underwater. You can start to guess where a submarine might be, and then you send these depth charges out. It's an explosive that goes at the number of feet that you set it to. And the other thing that really is deadly to submarines is radar, which sends out, electromagnetic signals in the air, and that comes back and tells you where things are. And the thing about radar that's really just crazy is you have to remember submarines, the vast majority of the time, are not under the ocean. They're on the surface of the ocean. And submarines only dive when they're going into battle. And so if you have planes flying in every direction with radar, and they can pick up a submarine over here, what the planes then would do is veer off, and they would try to shoot the submarines, put holes in it so it can't dive, or drop bombs on it before the submarine's able to dive, and that does it disrupts submarines all over the place. So sonar and radar become these massive technologies that start to shift the naval conflict towards the United States and its allies. Now, before we get back to that, we need to talk about what's happening in the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. The bloodiest battle in all of human history happened. It's called the Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans go deep into, they're picking different cities, Moscow, and then also they're supposed to pick off Stalingrad because it's an important city. It's also named after Stalin. Hitler, that's one of his major targets. He sends this gigantic million-man army to go get it. The problem is, Stalin tells his troops inside the city of Stalingrad, die to defend it. Nobody leaves that city, you need to die. And so the Germans have to blow up big parts of the city just to kill the army that's defending it. And finally the Germans take the city, but they're slowed down, and the weather's starting to get cold. And they finally take the city, and they have to do house-to-house fighting to clear all the Russian soldiers. And after they do that, they're like, yay, we got the city. And then Stalin just sends other troops around, and they surround the city. And they say, hey, good job. Stalin says, good job, it's your city. You can have it. Now you're cut off, and you can stay in that city when the weather turns -30, -40 at night. Enjoy. And you're cut off from supplies. You're cut off from food. You're cut off from ammunition. You're stuck there. Good luck. And what Stalin is doing is what the Russians did to the Napoleon. They're going to use the weather. And now this gigantic German army is stuck in Stalingrad, and they're begging for help. They have summer uniforms, so they're cold, they're freezing. They're begging Hitler to save them. Another German general wants to do what's called a breakout maneuver to get that army out of there, but Hitler says they're on their own. And now they're stuck in this destroyed, blown out city, and now the Russians start bombing their own city too. And the men in there are starving. There's rumors of cannibalism. Germans start bribing Soviet children to get water for them at the river, and Stalin tells his snipers to shoot his own Russian children to not help them. It turns into absolute pandemonium. But here's the thing: at the end of this battle, which now it goes over a couple months in the coldest parts of the winter, the German army gets captured, whatever's left of it, and pretty much everyone in there, all these prisoners of war are murdered. The entire army is obliterated. 2 million men. A few more Soviets than Germans were killed. 2 million men in one battle. 2 million men. That's like 3 times the amount of people that died in our Civil War in one battle. And this is a turning point now, because from this point forward, the Soviets will now start marching the Germans out of the Soviet Union, and once they get out of the Soviet Union, they're going to start pushing towards Germany, and they are not happy. And Stalin's officers release the controls on his men, and there starts to become brutalities towards the civilian populations committed. So Stalingrad, horrible battle. Ultimately, the Germans lose it, and now the Russians are pushing the Germans back, the Nazis back towards their home country. Just a couple things because it's interesting. This is why you don't murder large populations, other than the fact that it's unethical and evil. But like when you have to fight everyone, now you have to fight everyone. These are Soviet women. I can't remember the translation, but they were called night witches because you were killing everyone. So what happens now? Women who like sweep and keep the house clean during the day, at nighttime they take rifles. They go out into the woods and they look for the campfires where Germans are keeping warm, and they shoot them in the face or the neck, and then they go home. And every night these women come out. They're done with their housely duties. They kill Germans every night. The Germans hated them. They were terrified of them. They knew they would come as soon as it gets dark, but you have to be by a fire, otherwise you're going to die. This is how horrible it is fighting building to building in a blown-out city. This is when the Germans are pushing the Russians out. This is what happens when tanks start breaking down because the weather's too cold to support them. I wanted to give you an idea of how brutal the destruction of Stalingrad is. I'm going to overlay two photos here. This is a picture before the war, or before the battle. This is a picture after the battle, almost lined up on the same spot. Look at the level of destruction in that city, just gone. Okay, now target 3, going back to the United States, regarding the liberation of Europe, this is June 1944, and this, of course, is D-Day. D-Day is the largest amphibious invasion of any place in the history of the world. The United States, because Britain had not been taken over, starts flooding Britain with millions of troops. And not just the United States, Canada's there, Australia's there, there's a lot of other countries there, and they're flooding, they're building up huge troop amounts on Britain, and they're clearly going to invade the continent of Europe. And so the continental part of Europe. And so the Nazis have been knowing this is coming for years. At some point they're going to be invaded, so they've been fortifying the coast. The United States now need to fool Hitler to think about where they're attacking. So if you look on the map, see the part where it says Dover? That's like the closest part to the continental part of Europe. And so they put General Patton there. He had smacked a soldier who was wounded, saying this guy had PTSD, and Patton was smacking him, telling him to get up and fight, and he was a coward. So Patton was punished by putting him in a fake base in Dover. They put a base up with inflatable tanks and thousands of tents, and they put Patton there doing radio calls every day. And so the Germans really start fortifying that part of the coast, thinking that's where the attack's going to come from. But that's not it. It's going to happen in Normandy, France, and this giant invasion. And if you've ever seen the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, which I have connected to these notes, you'll know what this looks like. The United States has to hit the beaches. They have to take the beaches. The beaches are fortified. The level of death is unbelievable. Because, think about jumping off a ship and being up to your waist in water while people are machine gunning you. You have absolutely no mobility. There's nowhere to go. The land is flat intentionally. And it's just a horror show. But once you take those beaches, once you take them over, now the United States has a foothold in Europe, and you're going to just start flooding them with troops. This is a picture from inside one of the ships. The ships would come down, they would drop the front ramp, and then men would pour off, and then the ships would go back and get more men. One of the things that nobody talks about in D-Day, and I think it's just one of the craziest parts, is the United States floated a pier like a transformer. It was this giant floating concrete metal thing that had been made buoyant. They floated from Britain onto the shore, and you're seeing a picture of it. And the Germans actually seen this thing coming, and they didn't know what it was. It was actually like a transformer. It's this giant thing, and when it hits, it creates see all the roads? It creates roads to a pier. And what that's doing is that allows deep water ships to come up to this pier and start unloading troops in the millions. That's what it's doing. You get thousands of tanks and men on these roads. But in order to set the pier up, you have to take the beaches first. And this just about the technological advances the United States had made. They create this thing so they can more efficiently dump thousands of men onto the beaches. Parts of this pier still exist today. You can see pictures of it. See the big ships pull up. They start driving tanks and vehicles right onto the shore. Okay, so let's get to this. So what happens here? This is like, we're in endgame now for World War II. The United States will take nothing but unconditional surrender from any of the aggressors from World War II. In 1945, the Soviet Union is just a block away from Hitler's bunker. Hitler shoots himself in the head and takes poison. He gives his wife, his recent wife, Eva Braun, poison, and his dog. And he shoots himself as well. He commits suicide. He did not want the Soviets to get their hands on him because they would have worked him over. Mussolini tries sneaking out of Italy dressed as like a commoner or an officer, and they catch him and they beat his head and they shoot him and they hang him upside down and impale him. And that's a picture of he and his girlfriend there. And so on May 8th, 1945, Europe celebrates what's called VE Day, Victory in Europe. Like the amount of celebration is hard to explain in modern, like super divided America. Americans all over, and all of Europe, people were celebrating, but the amount of euphoria when you see the pictures, people were going wild because imagine, like, it really looked like, as Winston Churchill called it, looked like 1,000 years of darkness was coming to the world, and it was over now. At least the European part of this is over. And there's very famous pictures of people just grabbing strangers and kissing them. So let's finish now. There's still one war to go, and that's the war in the Pacific. The thing about the war in the Pacific is, like, it's really easy to look backwards in history and say, oh, the United States is going to win that. You should know that the first 6 months of World War II, the United States gets spanked by the Japanese. The Japanese win in just almost every conflict the United States fight in, whether it's Pearl Harbor or the Battle of Wake Island or the Battle of the Philippines or the Battle of Java Sea. The United States is losing. They're not prepared for war. They don't understand the vehicles, the advantages to the types of vehicles, especially the airplanes, or the disadvantages to the airplanes that they're fighting against. They're not prepared for this, and they are losing. They are losing for about 6 months. What happens? It starts to turn the war in the other direction. That is the Battle of Midway. You could actually say that this is one of the most important battles of World War II, and it's a naval battle. See, at the Battle of Midway, the United States fools the Japanese Navy. The United States cracks the code that the Japanese use back and forth when sending messages. And when they do that, they want to lure the Japanese Navy into a battle. The problem is the United States, our Navy is really weak, right? Like, everything was destroyed except these aircraft carriers and some support ships. And so the United States fools the Japanese to go to attack this island called Midway, where I believe there was a Marine base. And so the Japanese start attacking it, and when they do, the United States is like, oh, we got them. And so the United States hides their Navy, and they start searching the area for the Japanese Navy. But the thing is, if you don't know where they're at, whoever finds the other group's Navy first, they're going to win. And so the Japanese don't even know the Americans are there at first. But an American pilot, and I can't remember his name. I should attach it to the slide. He's from one of the aircraft carriers. He's flying, and when you get halfway through with your fuel, you have to turn around. And this guy refused to turn around. They're like, you got to turn around, or you're going to die out here. You're going to crash your plane. He goes, no, I'm going to go for another 20 minutes. And this pilot kept going for another 20 minutes. And sure enough, as he was starting to turn around to go back to his aircraft carrier, he saw this giant smokestack, and he'd found the Japanese Navy. And he radioed back. He goes, I see them. The United States, because they saw them first, launched this gigantic aerial attack from our Navy and from the island, and it took the Japanese off guard. They do tremendous damage to their Navy. They kill thousands of soldiers. They kill seamen. They destroy almost all of the Japanese aircraft carriers, and they lose like hundreds of airplanes because of that. Some of their best pilots. Many Japanese officers said that this was Pearl Harbor revenged, because the United States took a gamble that they could sneak attack them and pull this off with a much smaller Navy, and they do it. And from this point forward, the reason why this matters is from this point forward, the Japanese can't project power anymore. They have to start fighting a defensive war. Well, the problem for them is they're fighting a defensive war against an opponent that's getting stronger. The United States is putting more factories online. They're putting more weapons online, more ships online. They're training more soldiers. The United States is much larger than Japan. And every week, I believe Liberty ships, which is a type of cargo ships, the United States, some factories can produce one a week. They're like, boom, boom, full ships. And the Japanese cannot combat that, resource to resource. So the Japanese become desperate, and they employ one of the stupidest awesome weapons ever, or one of the awesomest stupid weapons ever, and that is called the kamikaze. And we talked about kamikazes before. Of course, kamikaze comes from the word divine wind, when the Japanese islands were being attacked by the Mongols, and they were spared by a typhoon. Well, what these were is the idea that the Japanese thought was, okay, well, we can strip all these planes of everything except bombs, and then we will just crash our planes into a ship. And if we could trade one airplane for a ship that has hundreds, if not thousands, of men on board, that's an amazing deal and will defeat the Americans. And so Japan unleashes this weapon, and especially early on, it's incredibly effective. Like, sometimes one airplane will take out an entire ship. And there's a psychological horror, too, that a man's trying to kill himself while trying to kill you, and the Americans have to deal with that. And so I put the numbers up. Almost 4,000 kamikaze pilots went on suicide missions, sinking 34 ships, killing thousands of men. Well, you'd say, well, that was awesome. That was an effective use of men and machinery. No, it's actually terrible. It's actually terrible. Because here's the thing. Yeah, it is a weapon of desperation, and it can be effective, but it's also dumb. Because here's the thing. Those 4,000 pilots that were killed, what if they weren't killed on one mission? What if those 4,000 pilots had run multiple missions? What if they'd run, another 30 missions apiece? And the other thing is, too, is these pilots were really well trained, and when they're dying, there's no one to train the next generation of pilots. And so what's happening is Japanese pilots are becoming worse and worse as the war is going on, and Americans that are having an easier time fighting their pilots. And so you would think as the war is going on, your pilots are getting better. They're actually getting worse because you're killing all of them. And so it is a weapon of desperation, and it can be effective, but it really damages their war effort as well. And you're actually seeing an actual kamikaze in that GIF. Okay, so how does Japan defeat it? FDR dies in office in his fourth term, and his vice president is Harry Truman. And Truman is given this basic fact. Look, the Americans are only going to accept an absolute surrender, unconditional, from the Japanese. And he says, the way to do that, we're going to have to do another Normandy-like landing in Japan. But the thing is, if you land troops on the Japanese islands, his military advisors are telling him a minimum of 1 million Americans will die. I said a minimum of American. To be honest with you, the numbers today, most modern historians say be much, 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 much higher than that, because Americans weren't aware of a lot of the things that the Japanese were doing to prepare for this, like training children and civilians to fight the GIs, roll under jeeps, pull grenades. They weren't aware of 15,000 airplanes that they were saving just for the invasion of Japan to use for suicide attacks. The Americans were really... The other thing, too, is... So Truman's got to figure out, are we going to do this? Because we want unconditional surrender. We don't want to have to fight them again another 5 years. How do we do it? Are we willing to have 1 million plus Americans die? There is only one way that Truman came to the conclusion to avoid this many casualties. And whether this is right or wrong, this is what it is. And that's this thing that he was made aware of. It's called the Manhattan Project. Before World War II, I think it was 1939, a German Jew, Albert Einstein, told our president at that time, FDR, that the Germans are working on creating a weapon around splitting the atom. The idea is that atom's the smallest item in the universe. If you split one, and if it's made of a radioactive isotope, it should give off insane amounts of energy. I mean, that's the basics of it, if you can actually split one. And so the Germans were working on this program, and Einstein he wrote a letter to the president, and give the president credit. He read it, and he's like, what if they are working on a weapon like this, and what if it actually succeeds? Imagine World War II, except now the Germans have nuclear or atomic bombs. And so FDR takes the letter seriously, and he creates what's called the Manhattan Project, a project that started in New York, where he hired thousands of people on this super secret program to create the first atomic bomb before the Germans can do it. And it employs thousands and thousands of people. And as it turns out, they pulled it off. They succeeded. The two they did this thing called the Trinity test, which I'm sure you're aware of from your American history. They actually detonate one of these bombs, Oppenheimer, and the amount of damage it does is way greater. It was detonated in the desert. It's way bigger than they thought it would be, and they have just enough of this material, this radioactive refined material, to make two bombs. They have you have enough refined uranium and enough refined plutonium to do this. The one bomb, and write this down, is called Little Boy. Little Boy is very long, and it has a uranium bullet in a gun in the back of the fin. And when it drops, it will fire the uranium bullet into a pile of uranium in the nose of the bomb. And the idea is, like, they don't know what they're doing, right? The idea is that, okay, you can make a bomb go off in the desert, but now you've got to actually detonate it in combat. So they're like, well, if we fire a bullet made of this stuff into a pile of it, it should detonate it, right? That seems reasonable. And so they create Little Boy, a uranium bullet device. And the reason why I'm going over this part is because this has never been done before, so they're just trying to come up with the most effective ways possible. The second bomb, which there's actually there's a recreation of it at Dayton, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It's called Fat Man. Fat Man is what's called a plutonium implosion device. The reason why Fat Man is fat is because there's a pile of refined plutonium in the middle of it. And there's a ring of explosives all around it, all aimed at the plutonium. And when it needs to, it will send a signal, and all of those explosives will go off at once, aimed directly at that pile, and it should ignite it. They did not know this, but this is a way more effective bomb, because the Little Boy, when it fires, it will start a nuclear chain reaction, but it will only do it on the molecule of the uranium that it hits, and the rest will be blown away. Fat Man is going to ignite all of the plutonium because there's nowhere for it to go as all these explosions hit it. So, but the point is, they're trying these different things. So how does the war end? The atomic bomb ends the war. What America does is America starts firebombing Japan with regular bombs, and they're doing tremendous damage to the Japanese cities. Once America takes the islands closest to the main islands, like Okinawa, they can start bombing day and night. But the generals say, we'll leave a few cities untouched by bombs. We want a few cities pristine. And the reason why they want them pristine is they want to show the Japanese the power of this new weapon. So what the Japanese do in late July, is they start flying over the city called Hiroshima, depending on how you anglicize it. They start flying over Hiroshima, and they start dropping just one plane a day, and they'll drop it looks like a bomb. It's a canister, and it fires leaflets out. And the leaflets say, evacuate the city, your military cannot save you. And the Japanese conclude that this is just propaganda, that the United States is just trying to scare them. And Hiroshima is actually a fairly major military city. It had 20,000 troops in it. And so every day they would drop this canister saying, leave the city. And then finally, the United States, on August 6th, 1945, fly over the Enola Gay, and it drops Little Boy. And Little Boy fires, and it's meant to hit the center of the city right by this bridge, and it hits, and the explosion is way bigger than they even anticipated it being. The way that the bomb goes off, when the atomic bomb goes off, everything in the immediate area of the explosion is vaporized. It turns to gas. It just turns to gas. And then it shoots out these gamma rays, like this X-rays, basically, and anything that gets hit by that in this direct area is killed instantly. And then it shoots out a fireball that blows out and starts burning everything, and then it fires off a shock wave, which is the concussive force that basically turns the city into shrapnel and blows it into every direction, creating almost like a hurricane in every direction, turning your own city into shrapnel, killing everything in that vicinity. And then the other part is it starts spraying out radiation, which was not something that the United States or the Japanese had a really great conception of. And the radiation itself is also dangerous, and it gets onto particulates and starts killing people. Just to give you an idea of the forces here, and then I'll move on. The bomb is so unbelievably powerful that it hits that river, and it shoots out this fireball, and the river itself superheats so quickly that it can't turn to steam. So the river is basically like thousands of degrees, and people are trying to get away from the shrapnel and the fireball, and they start jumping into the river, and their skin just flies off. It's superheating. That's just touching about the forces. Anyhow, the United States immediately asked the Japanese for a surrender. The Japanese do not, and the Japanese don't know how many bombs. Maybe that's the only bomb they have. So America goes 1, 2, and on the third day, the United States sends off the second and only other atomic bomb they have. And they send it at a city called Kokuru. But now at this point, the Japanese are on high alert. Any individual bombers flying alone, they're targeting, and it has to veer off. This bomber has to veer off. It's being targeted by Japanese fighters, and it has a secondary target. It's not allowed to come back. Once the bomb is armed, it can't come back. The secondary city is Nagasaki. Nagasaki, which is not far from Hiroshima, and many of the survivors of Hiroshima went to Nagasaki and were now in there. They dropped the bomb, and Hiroshima, the little boy killed up to 166,000 people immediately. Well, they drop Fat Man, and it kills 80,000 people in Nagasaki. And you might say to me, Mr. Rico, you said that Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, is a bigger bomb. Oh, it is much bigger. It's like a 22 kiloton explosion, whereas little boy's like 15 or 16 kilotons. We go, why does it kill less people? To tell you how powerful Fat Man is, it missed the city by 2 miles and landed in the mountains, and the explosion still came into the city and killed 80,000 people. At this point, Japan has no idea how many bombs the United States has, and they're thinking that in another 3 days, another city will disappear. Japan surrenders unconditionally, and VJ Day is on September 2nd, and the war is completely over. Now, I don't want to end the unit without at least talking a little bit about the atomic bomb a little bit further. This is Hiroshima, where little boy is dropped. It's we dropped right on that bridge, and this is the before, and this is the after. As you can see, everything is just gone. That is the power of one of these weapons. This is a body that's been incinerated. This woman, to tell you how insanely powerful these weapons are, this woman was wearing a white and black patterned dress. The light that is given off from the bomb is so insanely hot that the black part of her dress superheated and then scarred her body just from the light is so bright. These are keloid scars. This is what, like when the radiation hits people's bodies, it starts to bubble up their skin. You can see how they puff up like that. This little boy had half of his face burned off. I mean, this is there's obviously a huge debate on whether the U.S. should or shouldn't have done this. Whatever your thoughts are for or against, you should always know what the result is. And so the thing about this, and from the Japanese perspective too, they're seeing injuries that no human's ever seen before. This is a new weapon. There's nothing like this. And the Japanese are trying to figure out, like, what am I looking at? Like, what kind of weapon can do this simply because your face is turned one way, that you're exposed, and it does that. And to that point, this lady's face is burned off, but she's still alive. And the doctors can't do anything for her. Every year in Hiroshima, in August, on the 6th, they actually release so many doves in remembrance. You know, for decades and decades and decades, the chances of getting cancer are actually a little higher in Hiroshima from some of the leftover radiation. It's much diminished now. Anyhow, that is World War II. If you have any questions, just shoot Mr. Rico an email or find me in class. I hope that made sense, guys. You have an awesome day.